guys, welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be doing my February book wrap up, and I'm going to be sharing some books that I read and loved this month. Two of them in particular I loved so much that I had to get my own copy. And some of the other ones that I read, and I don't have the physical copies because I returned them to the library, or I had been given review copies from NetGalley and I read on my Kindle. So let's get started. The very first book that I'll be sharing is called The Upstairs Room by Johanna Rees. And this was actually a book, I mentioned it briefly in one of my other book videos, but I didn't get into the details. But this is actually a book that I had read back in 6th grade in school. And it had such an impact on me, it left such an impression on me, that I've thought about it many times over the years. I hadn't read it again since 6th grade, so it was kind of fun going back and reading it again as an adult. But when I decided to do our Europe unit this month, and we were talking a lot about World War II and things like that, I immediately thought of this book. And so I actually read this to my kids as a read aloud this year. And honestly, it was as good as I remember, maybe even better, honestly, because now I understand things differently as an adult. But the kids also really enjoyed this book. They didn't think they were going to in the beginning. They were kind of like, oh, but what about, you know, those fun fantasy books that we have, you know, waiting to be read in our read alouds. And so when I picked this one, they were kind of like, ah, but honestly, by chapter 2, like, they were hooked. And so this story basically, it takes place during the German occupation of Poland and Holland in 1940. And the story is about a young girl named Annie who I want to say, I think is 9 years old, I could be wrong, and one of her sisters, Cindy. And so when the Germans invade Holland, they have to go into hiding, and it talks about the family, the Gentile family that hid them in an upstairs room and what their experience was. And so this book honestly is just such a beautiful book, and it's such, I feel like these stories are such important stories to tell. And one thing that always strikes me is how none of the people, none of the characters, especially when it's like a first-hand account, which this kind of is, how no one saw it coming. I mean, people knew what was coming, but no one really thought, at least very few people actually thought it was going to get as bad as it did. And so us knowing what happened with the Jews and the concentration camps, and I mean, people of all nationalities that were killed and imprisoned and sent to these camps during this time, we know as readers that this is coming. And so you're kind of like, get out as you're waiting, you know, watching the characters going, wow, I don't think it's going to get that bad. That's not going to happen here. We should just stay here. And in the back of your mind, you're like, run, like, get out. And so I always kind of find that interesting, and there were definitely a lot of those moments in this book. But yeah, if you have not read this, this is a fantastic book. You can see The Upstairs Room by Johanna Rees. I definitely give this book 5 stars. So the next one I talked about in another video, I think my library haul video, and I had checked out a bunch of Viola Shipman books. And so I started with the recipe box, and fun fact, I didn't know this until I read it in the at the end of the book, but Viola Shipman is actually a pen name for a male author, which totally caught me off guard. His name is Wade Rouse. And so he writes under the pen name Viola Shipman, which was actually his grandmother's name. And he chose that name to write under because he was so inspired by her life and so many of her things that that's where he found the inspiration for the story. So the recipe box was everything that I hoped it would be. As I was kind of telling you guys what it was about in my library haul video, by the time I finished, I was like, yeah, I definitely want to read this because I think I'm really gonna like it. And I more than liked it. I loved this book. I do not give books 5 stars unless I think they are like incredible. And so even really good books, I don't give 5 stars unless it like blows me away. And this story definitely did. And like I said in my other video, I think part of the reason for that was because I have such strong female ties in my family. I have such close relationships with the women in my family, my mother, my grandmother, my sister, my cousins, my aunts. We're all so close, and cooking and recipes are such a huge part of our life and our relationships that I knew instantly that I would probably like this book. And so it actually even inspired me to gift this book. My grandmother and my mom both just had birthdays recently, and so I sent them each a copy of this book. And I plan on doing this for my nieces as well. When they turn 13, I want to give them a recipe box with lots of our family recipes in it. And so I actually have my grandmother's already writing recipe cards, and some of the other women in my family. And so this book was so beautiful. There are actually recipes at the beginning of each chapter. And so fair warning, this book will make you very hungry. Like every time my husband was like, "What are you doing?" I would be in bed and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that sounds so good." And I'd run across this like cherry chip cake recipe, and I was like, "Ooh, that reminds me of my Aunt Char's cherry bundt cake. Where is that recipe?" And so I hopped out of bed and I ran into the kitchen and started going through my own recipe box. And so it was just really fun. I actually did make the strawberry shortcakes from this recipe, and they turned out really good. They were super yummy. And so that's a recipe that I'm going to write on a recipe card, and I'm going to write a little bit about why I picked that recipe and where it came from, and I'm going to put it in my box. And so, yeah, I loved this book. I'm going to start the charm bracelet by the same author next, and I'm super excited to read that one as well. So the next book that I want to share with you is one of the ones that I had gotten an advance copy of from NetGalley, and it is published by Hallmark Publishing. It's called Rescuing Harmony Ranch, and the author is Jenny Martz. I'll throw a picture of the cover up here in a box for you. But it was a really good book too. I really love this book. And I know a lot of people, always feel one way or the other about Hallmark style stories, whether they're actually from Hallmark or not. But those kind of happily ever after stories, a lot of people find them predictable, and so they think that they're boring, but I am the total opposite of that. I actually love that predictability. I love knowing that this story is going to end happily, and I don't know, I just feel like those are the kind of like happy, fuzzy, like, you know, feel good stories. And I love them because I feel like so many things are already uncertain in life that sometimes I just want a really easy, fun, happy book to read. And I have to say that I do think Hallmark does a great job at that. And so this book in particular, it is out now. I think it came out, I think it's out. It may not be out. If it's not out already, it's coming out within the next couple days. But I'm not a big like ranch kind of person, even though I love ranches and I love horses and I love that country life. Sometimes I feel like ranch style stories are kind of like stereotyped. So at first I was like, I don't know if I'll really like this like setting or whatever, but I started to read it, and of course I fell in love with it. And it's about, the protagonist is this woman who is she lives in New York City, you know, she's got her career and stuff there, and her grandmother who lives out in the country, I want to say it was Montana. But anyway, she gets into a car accident and hurts herself, and so she calls her granddaughter to come back to the ranch and help her. And so the ranch is kind of like part working ranch, part like historic, I don't even know how to describe it, but they dress in like the traditional like pioneer type clothing, and they teach people about what life was like back in the early 1900s, like soap making and like these different skills and things that are like lost arts nowadays. And so she comes home, and she runs into her ex-high school sweetheart. And so of course, you know, sparks start flying again between the two of them, and it's kind of like got that "you're annoying, but I'm still attracted to you" kind of trope. And so she ends up discovering that the ranch is actually in a lot of financial trouble. And so her and her ex Mac. Jocelyn and Mac are the two main characters' names. They've got to kind of try to figure out a way to now save the ranch. And so there's some meddling grandmothers involved and, you know, all that small town good stuff, which I just eat up. So it was a really, really good story. I'm so glad that I read it. It was a really good book. I love reading Hallmark right before I fall asleep, like in bed, because it leaves you with just like such a happy, bubbly feeling. Like, I'm not the type of person, I can't watch like really tense like action movies or really like sad movies before I go to bed. Like, I like to go to bed feeling good. Okay, so the final book that I'm going to share with you today is another book that I was not disappointed in. I mean, it was phenomenal. It was fantastic. I will probably end up buying my own copy of this. Like I said, I try to only buy the ones that I really, really love and I know I'll read again. And the only reason I haven't bought a copy of this one yet is because I have so many books like it in that genre. Like, it reminds me of like Lilac Girls, the Alice Network, all those, like that type of historical fiction novel. And so it is called The Paris Library. It was written by Janet Skeslien Charles. And so it's actually, the story is, it's based off of a true story of the librarians of the American Library in Paris, who were literally like heroes during World War II. So this story is kind of interesting because it jumps timelines. Part of the book takes place in Paris in 1939, and the other part of the book takes place in Montana in the 1980s. And so it's really interesting. Now, normally stories like that, I either love them or hate them. I'm not a big fan of like alternating timelines, mostly because sometimes it can just be too confusing, especially if you're following like a lot of different characters. But this book actually did it really well. And it was interesting because it took a character from the 1939 timeline and also put them in the 1980s timeline, which made it, at least for me, it made it easier to follow. Sometimes if they're just completely different characters and you're reading it and trying to figure out how the two connect, it can be a little confusing. But this was not like that at all. And it was really, without giving any spoilers, it was just incredible. I mean, anytime I read these World War II novels, I've probably said this before in videos, it just always blows my mind to think about the kinds of decisions that these characters had to make. And it's so easy for us to say what we would have done had we been in those positions, but you don't really know until you're in that position. You don't know what you would do if you were hungry and desperate and the people you loved, their lives were at risk. We'd like to think that we would do certain things, and maybe we would. But maybe we wouldn't. And so it was just, it's heart-wrenching to see these characters that you love making decisions that you know are going to be bad decisions. And it's amazing to see how, in these times, how desperate people become. And I think one of the saddest things during those times is when neighbors and friends and even family begin to turn on each other. And I felt the same way with the book that I recommended in one of my last videos, Sisters of War. It was kind of like the same thing, because characters during war, these people during war, are faced with these just like unsurmountable odds and these insane scenarios, and they're just pushed into corners where sometimes they make really, really bad, desperate decisions. And so this book was incredible, and it ends on kind of a happy note. It's not like a happily ever after story by any means, but the characters do kind of find peace with the things that they've done, even though you wish that they would have done things differently or gone back to make up for some of those things that they had done wrong. But that's just not the reality of it. And so this book was phenomenal. I really, really loved this book. So another book that I'm halfway through I wasn't sure if I was going to tell you about this one or not, but I figure I may as well since I started it in February. But it's called Resistance Women by Jennifer Chiaverini. Actually, one of you guys recommended her work to me when I was telling you how much I liked historical fiction in another book video. And so I was like, ooh, let me check out what she's written. And so there were several of them that sounded really good, but I started with Resistance Women, and I'm actually listening to that one on Audible, and I'm about, I think I've got about 15 hours left. I'm not very far into it, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the story yet. It's good. It's a little bit slow in the beginning, that I may change my mind once we really like get into the thick of it. But so far I feel like it's just a little bit slow, and I don't know, something about a few of the ways the author worded a couple of different things. I was kind of like, is she trying to make a point? Like, I hate when authors are writing historical fiction and they try to tie in modern day politics and events. Like, that really turns me off, because I'm like, they are not one and the same. They are, even though history repeats itself, I definitely agree with that. And there are tons of similarities between things that happened in the past and the things that are going on now, especially in a world, view. But I hate when they try to make modern day political points in a historical fiction novel. You can make modern day political points, but do it in a contemporary novel. That's just my opinion. And I'm not sure if that's what she's doing yet or not, but I kind of got that feeling. And so I'm kind of like, I'm not really sure what to expect with the rest of the book, but it is engaging. I am enjoying it. I'm definitely going to finish it. And so hopefully next month I will be able to tell you a little bit more about what it was actually about and what I thought of it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As usual, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.